Good afternoon. It's good to see everybody tonight. Appreciate your presence. If you're visiting with us, we especially are glad to have you. Turning your Bibles, if you would, to Numbers chapter 32. If you're doing the daily Bible reading this year, if you're following the Mark Roberts schedule, the one that we usually put on the credenza in the back, then this particular study comes from our reading this week. It's always been a kind of an intriguing chapter to me. And I hope some of the things that we talk about this evening will be of some help to you. I would love to take the time to read the entire chapter. Not going to do that. Let me kind of summarize what's happening. If you're not doing the daily Bible reading, at least that way you'll know a little bit about what's going on. When we come to this point in the book of Numbers, the children of Israel are concluding their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And if you think through in practical terms what this means, this must have been a pretty exciting period of time for the children of Israel. For one thing, it's a very young crowd. Everybody over the age of 20 when they came out of the land of promise, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, will be dead before they go into the promised land. And so, for the most part, the nation at this point is under 60 years old. And what that means is, in a lot of ways, there's still a lot of zest for life. This is a group of people that have, many of them, been raised in the wilderness, born and raised as the children of Israel wandering around. And they have survived for all of their lifetime, some of them. On the manna that God fed them every day, they've seen all kinds of wonders. The pillar of cloud that stood over the tabernacle is very much a part of their life. The pillar of fire that is there in the evening is something that they have always known. They've never seen the world without God's presence among them. Moses is still with them. Joshua has become more and more prominent. Aaron has just passed away. And as they come to this chapter, they have moved out of the wilderness proper up to the eastern side of the Jordan River, down south of the Jordan, and they have gone around Edom, and they've gone around Moab because God prohibited them from attacking the Edomites and Moabites because they are relatives. And as they come to this point, they have been attacked, if you would. The kings of the Amorites, Sihon and Og are their names, and they pretty much rule everything on the east side of the Jordan above the nation of Moab. And the children of Israel, when they began to come into that land, Sihon first and then Og, the king of Bashan, come up and do battle with them. They are not going to allow them to go through the land, and God has won great victories for them. Now I want you to appreciate what that had to have meant. This group of young people have spent their life wandering around out in a very desert-like country, are now coming into a land that is much more attractive, and those who are defending the land have been absolutely devastated by this people, just like God said was going to happen. And just on the other side of the Jordan River is the land of Canaan. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. Some of these people would have been around 40 years ago, back when the spies went into the land and brought back the fruit of the land, clusters of grapes carried on a rod between two men, and the glowing accounts of how wonderful the land was. And yet, they also knew that there were walled cities, that there were giants in the land, that the Canaanites were a very fierce people, and yet they have just defeated people just like that. And it must have been a very exciting time for them. And so they are gathering upon the plains of Moab just across the Jordan River from Jericho, and they are preparing themselves to go into the land. And it's at this point that this particular chapter takes place. The leaders of the tribe of Reuben and Gad, along with half the tribe of Manasseh, come to Moses and to the elders. I want you to notice that. To Eleazar the priest, Aaron has died, so Eleazar the priest and Moses and the leaders of the people in verse 2. And what they ask for is an inheritance, but the way that they say it is, in verse 4, The country that the Lord defeated before the congregation of Israel is a land for livestock, and your servants have livestock. Therefore they said, if we have found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servants as a possession. Do not take us over the Jordan. Moses' reaction to this, and since we're talking about Moses this month, this kind of dovetails with the theme. Moses' reaction to this is harsh, to say the least. And his concern is that they are not going to go into the land and help their brethren take the land of Canaan. That they're just going to stop right there. And so, beginning in verse 6 or so, what you have is Moses' reply. And we're going to come back to this and talk about it in some detail. And what they reply to Moses, if you get down to verse 16 and following, is, no, you've got the wrong idea. We're not going to sit here. And notice Moses says in verse 6, shall your brethren go to war while you sit here? They said, no, you've got the wrong idea. Our men are going to go over and fight with you, but we would like to have this land. It's a high plateau. It's a tableland. It is a land that's very fertile but well suited to livestock. And so Moses says, okay, if that's what you're going to do, we're going to hold you to it. And he tells Joshua, okay, when you go over into the land, if they don't do what they said they're going to do, you make them cross over. And they can have the land on the west side of the Jordan. And you look at this on the surface and you go, oh, okay, so what's the big deal about this? This is an interesting passage of Scripture. And I want to make a couple of observations for us this evening. Probably the Sunday night crowd is not the crowd that's the most suited to a couple of the things that I'd like to note. But perhaps we can kind of create a culture to address this attitude. I want you to appreciate, beginning in verse 6, that when Moses replies to these people, Moses' concern is that they are going to discourage their brethren. And so the first observation that I would make from this chapter is there's a real danger in discouraging other people. And as you look at it, Moses' question is, are you just going to sit here? And on its face, what they appear to be doing is thinking very selfishly. Now, we know, because we get to read the whole chapter, that that's not what they're thinking unless. I want you to appreciate that their request is reasonable, but so is Moses' response. And Moses' response is reasonable because for the last 40 years, this is the kind of stuff he has seen from the children of Israel. He has watched them be faithless in regards to God. He has watched the spies go into the land and come back with a less than glowing report. In fact, I think his concern's exceptionally reasonable when you start looking at his reply in verse 8. Read with me. He says, thus your fathers did, or I guess start verse 7. Why will you discourage the heart of the children of Israel from going over into the land that the Lord has given them? And remember, this had to have been an exciting time for them. Thus your fathers did when I sent them away from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. When they went up to the valley of Eshcol and saw the land, they discouraged the heart of the children of Israel so that they did not go into the land that the Lord had given them. The Lord's anger was aroused on that day, and he swore with an oath, saying, surely none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and above shall see the land that I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they not wholly followed me, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite and Joshua the son of Nun, for they have wholly followed the Lord. So the Lord's anger was aroused against Israel. He made them wander in the wilderness 40 years until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was gone. And look, you have risen up in your father's place, a brood of sinful men, to increase still more the fierce anger of the Lord against Israel. For if you turn away from following him, he will once again leave them in the wilderness, and you will destroy all of these people. Next time you think that the preacher gets up and is a little hard, go read that section again. Because what Moses tells them is, don't you understand you're doing the same thing that the spies did? And there is a kind of a secondary application that I would offer here. The spies were men chosen by Moses to go into the land because they are described as leaders among the people. If you go back to the original rendering in Numbers chapter 13, they were men of great influence. And the reason that they could discourage an entire generation from doing what God asked them to do is because men of influence are men of influence. I want you to look around the room. Everybody here has some influence, folks. Some people in this room have a lot of influence because of age, because of spiritual maturity, for one reason or another. And we have to appreciate, and I think this is what Moses is doing, we have to appreciate the potential of what influence can do, not only for good, which we talk about all the time. Let's be lights, let's be salt. But influence for bad. And this is what Moses has seen from the leaders of Israel for 40 years. It's easy to think Moses is being unreasonably harsh, but given their history, I think you have to appreciate that Moses' suspicions, in his mind, were probably well-founded. But what he addresses is the concern that if these 2.5 tribes don't go fight with everybody else is going to go, we've just lost 20% of our fighting force. And if they've left and we ain't even started the conquest, what's going to happen the first time that we face a big army and we're relying on people who aren't there with us? And remember, they said this in front of all the leaders of the people. And so that's Moses' concern. It's a concern that we ought to think about a little bit. We are a family. Every local congregation is a family, much the way the children of Israel were. And what we do and how we do it, our dispositions, our attitudes, our devotion in regards to this family is significant. And so let me ask you to think about this for a second. Everybody here, no matter if you think, well, I don't really have much influence here, nobody pays any attention to me, woe is me, I'm going to eat some worms. How much do you think about the impact of your activities on this group of people? That's really what Moses is addressing. What you're asking and what you're deciding is going to influence your brethren. And we've seen this happen before and it didn't go well for us. I don't want to see it happen again. And so the question that we really need to address is when I make decisions in my life, and I'm not talking about good or evil decisions necessarily, just decisions, judgments. What do I do? What do I not do? Where do I go? When do I go? How do I interact with other people? How do I not interact with other people? Where are my priorities? Where are my concerns? How much of what we all do, and we all have decisions to make. We got birthdays, we got travel, we got the end of school, we got spring break, we got job responsibilities, we have retirement, we have this, we have that. We all lead busy lives. How much do we think about the impact of the things we do on everybody else? And are we encouraging one another, or are we discouraging one another? Hypocrisy is discouraging. When you give out yourself to be someone who loves the Lord, and yet that's not evident in the things you do and the life that you lead, that discourages people that take note, doesn't it? Complaint, dissatisfaction. One of the problems the children of Israel had, and that God addresses a number of times to the point of making the statement very specifically, is they would murmur in their tents. They didn't like something that God told them to do, and rather than coming to Moses, now occasionally they'd just rise up in rebellion, but occasionally what they'd do is they'd all go back home and they'd just sit around and gripe about it. Now, I don't see that happening much here, but the interesting thing is the nature of murmuring is you don't see it happen much. That kind of constant dissatisfaction, that's discouraging to brethren. Lethargy is discouraging. You know, sometimes because we all have individual relationships. Discipleship is first and foremost individual. We all understand that. Jesus said, if any man wants to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And I can be faithful without you being faithful, and you can be faithful without me being faithful. First and foremost, discipleship is individual. But I'm going to tell you something about each one of us as individuals. The way we worship or don't worship, our growth or lack of growth, and I'll tell you how you see that. You see that in Bible class. You see that in priority. You see that in the things that people talk about and the things that they do and where their attention is and where their focus is. Devin talked about a little of that this morning. You know, this idea of I'm becoming more spiritual and less temporal, that's a mark of growth. The fruit of the Spirit that we sang about this morning, those are indications of growth. If you're not growing spiritually, the chances are pretty good other people see it. And you may not like to acknowledge it, but that's part of the reason that we're a group. Ephesians 4, we're supposed to be helping each other. Lethargy, this is not as important to me as it is to you, and so therefore growth is not a big deal to me. That's discouraging to other Christians who are trying to grow. And we can make that application in regards to a lot of things. Lethargy is discouraging. Inconsistency is discouraging. And it's very tempting and very easy to make the application first and foremost all the time in regards to attendance. Well, I think there's some truth there. But even greater than that is this hot and cold that you see people engage in local congregational work. One semester we're teaching, the next semester we're not anywhere to be seen. One week we're on fire and talking to people about the gospel, and the next week the people we've invited show up, but we don't. One Bible class we are engaged in, the next quarter we're just kind of there. Inconsistency is discouraging. You see that scripturally. You see the Apostle Paul pleading with people to make sure that they're walking according to the calling with which they've been called. And we need to appreciate that when we're taking from a group but not giving to the group, that can be really discouraging. Negativity can be discouraging. So I'll paint the bullseye on me. And I've told you this before. My disposition, I do not know why. I see what's wrong. If the clock's crooked, that's the first thing I notice. If the picture on your wall is crooked, I notice it. If there's lint on something, I notice it. It drives me crazy. And I have to be careful because it can become discouraging. A refusal to engage can be discouraging. We can make a lot of applications in this regard. My question is this. Even in matters of judgment, do I stop and think about the things that I do and how it affects others? Even to this point, this is something I notice, you may not. I have to miss services 2 or 3 times in the next 6 weeks because of work. Do I make a point of being here because I've been gone a lot? Or if a weekend comes along that I can get out of town, I'm getting out of Dodge without thinking about the fact that I haven't been here a lot. That's not a sinful thing, but it can be a very discouraging thing. I want you to appreciate something about this family and every family. And you really see this, I think, in the first couple of chapters of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, where God, through Jesus, through John, is addressing these 7 different congregations. And you learn a lot about these churches. You learn that some are pretty good and enthusiastic, and some are hot and cold. They're inconsistent, they're lukewarm, and they just make God want to spit them out of His mouth. That there are some that they don't want to stand up for anything. They're certainly not going to confront those within the congregation who are teaching false doctrine or are misleading people. And then there's others that are standing so strong that they'll die for the cause. And you see the differences in these congregations. And if God addressed us, what would He say? We are God's people. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 10. A people belonging to God. The older versions say peculiar to God. The newer versions say people for God's own possession. We are the pillar and ground of the truth, Paul writes to Timothy. This group of people in this community, wherever we live, collectively, we are standing up in this area for what is right in accordance with what the Bible says. We are a priesthood, set apart, holy to God. We are stones in the temple of God. There are all kinds of images that God uses to describe a local congregation, but let me tell you what I think of when I think of this. When Nehemiah goes back after the Babylonian captivity to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, you remember the story? And he gets there, and there's a couple of local rulers that have kind of filled in the power gaps when Judah and Israel were taken captive. And a couple of them are named Sanballat and Tobiah. And when Nehemiah gets there, what they realize is if the walls of Jerusalem go back up, Jerusalem's going to be a force and we can't be in control anymore. And they start trying to disrupt things. At first they threaten. And, the Israelites just go, okay, well, some of us will work, some of us will stand guard, or we'll work with our sword on, but you're not going to stop our work. Finally, they try to deceive Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 6, they invite him, hey, come down and let's talk about this stuff that's going on. And Nehemiah's reply is, I am doing a great work. I don't have time to come down and meet with you guys. We are doing a great work. And it merits our attention. It deserves our devotion. It should call to every person in this congregation a dedication to priority that says if I can be there, if I can encourage someone, if I can give what little I can give, whether it's in regards to worship, whether it's before worship, whether it's after worship, I am meeting with my brethren to consider one another to stir up love and good works. Hebrews 10 and verse 24. That's my priority. Please understand, folks, you'll never have more long-lasting influence on anybody in this world, long-lasting influence, than you will upon other people in this congregation. You know why? Because for every one of us, this congregation can be an issue of heaven or hell. If we're all doing our job right, if the elders are shepherding, if the deacons are serving, if the preachers are preaching the word, if the men are leading, if the women are contributing and being the help in their home and being the shining lights that they are to be in the household, if we're being lights in the world, if we're giving what we have to one another to make sure that we all come to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, then we are helping each other go to heaven. And I'm not sure we think about the local church that way. Do you? Do you seriously stop and think, sometimes just my being there when I could be somewhere else, That may encourage some of these folks. That may be encouraging to some of these parents that are struggling with children that aren't faithful. This may encourage some of these single people who don't have anybody else. They don't have a spouse that's helping them. This may encourage some of these young people whose life is torn between all the demands of the world. This may encourage our overseers so that they're not leading with grief. This may encourage other people. I can give and help somebody go to heaven. If you put it in those terms, would it make a difference? Maybe that's what we need to start doing at the announcements at the end of the service. Okay, we're going to meet at 5 o'clock this evening to help each other go to heaven. You'd be a little less inclined to skip out to watch it at the end of the golf tournament, wouldn't you? And I think it's important that we see we're doing a great work here. Moses was preparing these people to do a great work. They were going to take possession of the land of Canaan, which is symbolic of our possession of heaven. And he didn't want them to discourage their brethren. So, am I encouraging or discouraging? Now that's the big deal in this chapter. But I want you to appreciate something that's ironically a kind of a balance to that in this chapter. When you look at Moses' reaction beginning in verse 6, and he is worried about the discouragement of his brethren, Moses makes a couple of assumptions. And so let me suggest to you, we can also learn in this chapter the danger of making assumptions. And this is something that I think comes along with the relationship that we have with one another in the local congregation. Moses' reaction is harsh. Look at verses 14 and 15. Look, you've risen in your father's place, a brood of sinful men, to increase still more the fierce anger of the Lord against Israel. No, they hadn't. That's just not what was going on here. And as we've already pointed out, I think it's reasonable that Moses might draw that conclusion, and maybe the observation we can make from that is our history precedes us, folks. We all have a reputation. You may have a reputation for, buddy, that guy or that woman, they're encouraging, they're on the ball, they always say nice things, they always ask good questions, they help me to serve the Lord, they help me to go to heaven. And then there's people on the other end of the spectrum that, well, did you talk to so-and-so? No, I never saw them, they ran out the door, or they just didn't speak to me, or they only spoke to this person, only spoke to that person. I didn't really receive any encouragement. We all have a reputation that precedes us, and Moses is basing his conclusion on their reputation. So you can understand why Moses would make a wrong assumption. But nonetheless, he makes a wrong assumption. When you're part of a collectivity, and we are influenced by the activities of one another. And we could go to Ephesians chapter 4 once again, where that which every joint supplies brings unity and growth to the whole, so that we all come to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. We all have a part to play. But anytime there's that kind of collective interdependence between people that are independent and people that are serving the Lord because they have made their own decisions to serve the Lord, there's a lot of judgment involved in local congregational fellowship. And if you went to Ephesians 4, I think the reason that Paul starts that is by saying you need to walk worthy of the calling with which you are called, with lowliness and long-suffering, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And here are these things that bind us together. He starts off by reminding us of all the things that we have in common. But we all have a lot of things that cause us to be different. And as a result, we don't all think alike. We don't always judge things the same. Tracy and I were talking at lunch today about things in worship. And the different perceptions that we have about different ways to go about teaching, different ways to go about singing, different ways to go about praying. And as a preacher, I see things different than Tracy does. She made the observation, she said, but I'm not looking at it from the perspective of the preaching. We all have different perceptions. And we all bring baggage with us. We all have different backgrounds. Some of you have very diverse religious backgrounds. Some of you have no religious background. Some of you come out of an evangelical background. Some of you come out of a very tradition-bound background like Catholicism or Episcopalianism or Anglicanism. So we have all these different ways of looking, and we have all these different ways of thinking, and then we have different levels of growth. If you've been a Christian for a year, you probably don't know as much. Hopefully you don't know as much as someone that's been a Christian for 30 or 40 years. If you do, more power to you, and the person that's been a Christian 30 or 40 years, shame on you. But we have different levels of understanding, we have different levels of wisdom, we have different concerns, we even have different convictions sometimes about certain things. And fellowship's hard. And it demands a huge amount of judgment. If you'll keep your bookmark there in Numbers, and then flip over to Romans right quick, and I'm sure Devin will cover this well. He tells me because it covers everything in Romans very well. So I know he'll cover this well also. If you look at Romans 14 and 15, when he gets to the kind of application section of Romans, and especially because much of the Romans deals with different ways of appreciating how we are justified, and those of a Jewish background would probably have a much different view than those of a Gentile background. Paul starts this section in verse 14, or verse 1 of chapter 14 by saying, "Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things." Then he starts talking about people that think they can eat certain things and people think that they can't eat certain things, clean and unclean, things that have been offered to idols. And basically, if you read through that, what he says, and I think the essence is in verse 7, none of us lives to himself, no one dies to himself. In other words, we all have an influence. If we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or we die, we are the Lord's. In other words, first things first, make sure our relationship with the Lord is correct. And then he goes on in verse 10 to say, why do you judge your brother or show contempt for your brother? The reality is, as you go through the entire chapter, and it's very clear in verse 1 of chapter 15, we then who are strong, and by the word strong, I think he simply means more mature. We just have a better grasp of things. We've understood more. We that are strong ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. The whole point is, we need to think about each other, and there is the application. It's very easy to misconstrue people's activities. Why aren't they engaged? Why are they removed? Why do they seem hypocritical? Why do they never speak to me? Why this? Why that? And it's easy to draw conclusions that are not in evidence. It just is. We don't know all the time what's going on in each other's lives. And so I think one of the things that is imperative in local congregations is that while we have to make judgments from time to time, Galatians chapter 6, if a man's overtaken in a fault, you either spiritual restore such a one. Well, how do I know that they're overtaken in a fault? Well, I have to make some judgments. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 or 1 Corinthians chapter 5, there are times when we may have to actually ask the congregation to withdraw ourselves and not have social interaction with some member. Well, that demands some judgment about what's going on in their life as opposed to the Scriptures and their attitude about it all. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, warn the unruly, comfort the feeble-minded, support the weak. Well, that means I have to make some judgments about who's unruly and who's feeble-minded and who's weak. We have to make judgments. But we need to be careful about our attitude. Galatians 6 says we are to do these things with meekness, with consideration, with self-control, considering ourselves lest we're also tempted, with humility. Jesus tells us in Matthew 7, to judge not that you be not judged. With what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with what measure you measure, it will be measured to you again. And if you've got a plank in your eye, you need to not be trying to get the speck out of somebody else's eye. He's not condemning judgment. What he's saying is you need to be careful. And this is another way that unity in a local congregation comes about, folks. If somebody's struggling spiritually, we all have the responsibility to say something. You get that? Not just me or Devin or Larry or John, Tom or Mark because we're the preachers and the elders. Every member of this congregation if you're aware that somebody's struggling, you have a responsibility. Every member of this congregation. And you say, yeah, but what if I'm drawing the wrong judgment? What if I'm doing like Moses is doing and saying, you bunch of rebels? Don't you see what you're doing to this congregation? That's our point. We need to be careful. We need to be humble. We need to be loving. We need to be considerate. We need to make sure, as Jesus tells the Pharisees in John 7, to judge with righteous judgment. Don't neglect our responsibilities to one another, but proceed kindly, carefully, lovingly, humbly, and make sure that we are very careful that we do not draw wrong conclusions or that we do not place improper motives upon other people's actions. And that brings me to the last point, which is perhaps, strangely enough, the most famous statement in the entire letter, in the entire chapter, and won't require much commentary. When Moses is finished with his discussion and the children of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh say, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to arm ourselves. We're going to go fight. We're not going to go back and inherit our land until the last Jewish man has inherited his land. Moses tells them in verse 23, if you do not do so, then take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. Now, this is really not connected to the other two points that I've already made, but we need to get this, folks. There's no escaping the consequences of sin. If you want to put it in the context of the rest of the lesson, if I'm discouraging my brethren and neglecting my responsibilities towards you, or you're neglecting your responsibilities towards me, your sin's going to find you out. It's just a matter of time before someone is hurt. And even if it goes unpunished in this life, it won't go unpunished on the day of judgment. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in life, in all the stuff that happens to us, and we all have so many demands. We all have so many pressures. We all have so much emotional stuff that goes on in our lives, in our families, in our homes, in our jobs. And it's just so easy to only think about that and not think about brethren, without realizing that be sure your sins will find you out. I probably shouldn't say this, but it's funny to me. If you're offended, I apologize. Please take it as it is offered. My dad, from the time I was a kid, when he would talk about influence and the fact that if you do something wrong, it's gonna come out sooner or later. Just you better understand that principle. The way he would say that is, let me tell you something, son, you can't drink no beer. In other words, you start doing that kind of stuff, it's just a matter of time till somebody's going to find out. This is an interesting chapter to me. So many times, and we've talked about this a lot in the Old Testament class in the back, so many times we read the things in the Old Testament and we don't stop and think, why did God put this here? I mean, how many conversations did Moses have with people before they went into the Promised Land? And yet, look at all this detail about this conversation. Well, I'll tell you why he put it here. He put it here because we still have the same issues. We are doing a great work. And hopefully we're doing it with some degree of passion, enthusiasm, energy. And what congregations don't need is brethren who are discouraging one another, because they're not working, they're not participating, their values are wrong, their priorities are misplaced. We're trying to help each other go to heaven. And I'm going to need you, and you're going to need me, and we're all going to need each other. So let's make sure that we learn from this passage. I do not want to be one of these folks that God could say, why were you sitting at home while your brethren were fighting? God help us to be encouragements to our brethren. Thanks for your attention tonight. Let me say this. I don't aim that at anybody. This is something I struggle with as much as anybody else. Okay, so before you walk off and go, hey, you shouldn't have said those things. I know you were talking to me. If you feel like I was talking to you, that's on you, and it probably says you need to listen very carefully to what was being said. I'll deal with my conscience going out the door too. I just want us to be what God wants us to be. If you're subject to the invitation, we could help you. We invite your response while we stand and sing.